Good evening. Thank you all for coming. It's wonderful to see everyone this evening. I'm Judith Rue, and I chair the Kennedy Lecture Series. Tonight, it's my pleasure to introduce our speaker, Cory Richards. Cory is an accomplished climber and world-class photographer. He has twice summited Everest and climbed some of the world's tallest peaks. In 2012, he was named the National Geographic Adventurer of the Year. Cory has created a niche as one of the leading adventure and expedition photographers, traveling to the wild and remote corners of the earth, from Antarctica's unclimbed peaks to the Himalayas to Botswana and many more. There's so much more I could talk to you about, but I'm going to stop here. It's with great pleasure that I introduce Mr. Cory Richards.
All right. Let's do it. Sounds good. My name's Cory Richards. Thank you for that wonderful introduction. I'm always, these are actually my favorite venues to speak at. I end up in these wild, weird places, like the World Economic Forum, and you end up speaking to an audience, and they're looking at you like you have 8 heads, because they're like, well, how does this relate to us? But I feel like when I'm speaking to a slightly younger audience, or in a town that is really fueled by the university, there's a sort of an elevated thinking that allows me to be a little bit weirder, a little bit more on the fringe, and swear a lot more. So with that, I'll try to keep it to a minimum, but not really. So I'm going to start here. This is the summit ridge of Mount Everest. We're at about just below 29,000 feet without oxygen, and the sun is coming up over the Tibetan Plateau. I think this was May 24th, 2016. And this is sort of a pivotal moment in my life for a number of reasons, and I'm going to bring it all back to this place. But truthfully, I think it's important to take it as far back as we possibly can, which is really just indicative of a life of bad fashion decisions. But that's okay, you know, like sideways trucker hats, that's fine now, I guess. But really the point of this photograph is to show you that I was brought up in campgrounds. I was brought up in the outdoors. My parents felt as though it was a incredibly important, it was a means of education for my brother and I to be outside. And it was a way for us to balance academia against being a part of the natural world. So we grew up in campgrounds. They brought us up skiing. I started skiing when I was 2. I started climbing when I was 5. And so this was, when we were not home, we were here. We were in tents. And that was the seed of everything that was to come later in life. And I really have to stop and hover on this picture for a minute, because this is the most important relationship of my life. And without my brother, I certainly would not be the person I am today. I owe him a huge debt of gratitude. But it wasn't always that way. And I'm going to get into a little bit of psychology here, but my brother was born 2 years before I was, and my mom had severe postpartum depression with him. And what that does is it creates what's called an insecure attachment. For some of you who are in a psychology program, you'll recognize that term. Insecure attachments are hard in those 0 to 3 years and onwards up towards 7, because if you can't get your emotional needs met, you find effective ways to get those emotional needs met. If your primary caregiver is not meeting those needs, you find ways to do that. And unfortunately for me, he found the best method of getting those needs met was to beat the shit out of me. Now, this started from a very young age. You know, when I was basically, 0, when I came out, my brother was already dealing with this, because that's how deep these things are. And he figured out very early on that if he sort of put some aggression towards me, there was a lot of attention that came his way. And that scenario, that environment just grew on itself. It was never corrected. It was never something that my parents did wrong. They were doing their best, the best that they could. But what that did was put me in a situation it's called an inescapable stress. Inescapable stresses are the root of things like ADHD. They push our lives in incredible directions when we are experiencing these things in these early developmental years. An inescapable stress for me taught me from a young age that I wasn't being protected. And when you learn a lesson that you are not being protected when you're tiny, you learn a lesson of value. And you start to believe something that just isn't true, but you believe that you're not valuable. Because if I was valuable, why am I not being protected? And this made me feel very much like an outsider my entire life. The one place that I could go, the one place where I felt at home was in the outdoors. When we went climbing, there was no identity that was demanded of me. There was nothing that was demanded of me other than I showed up and I was present in the scenario and the situation, and I gave it everything that I had. That's what my parents asked of me, that's what the mountains asked of me, and that's where I felt most rooted. So I learned early on that this was a coping mechanism, to go to these places, to get away from these inescapable stresses. But it was also a place that I learned to push boundaries. And that idea that I somehow didn't belong started to creep into my social life. I was 12 years old when I went to high school. I was a smart kid, whatever that means. And so I went 2 years early. And 2 years later, after that, I was completely dropped out. So I went in getting straight A's. And by the time I would have been a freshman, I was skipping all of my classes, and I was basically failing out of everything. And my parents, who were both in education, were they were floored. They didn't know what was happening. They were so concerned about it. And as time went on, I went further and further down into sort of this abysmal depression. I was suffering from anxiety, but I couldn't talk about it. I didn't know how to talk about it. I did everything I could to push the social boundaries the same way that I had pushed boundaries in the mountains, and I learned to push boundaries. And finally, after a lot of debate and having been through a lot with my brother, they put me in a rehab, a residential treatment facility. It was based on the 12 steps. And I went back years later, and I took some pictures of the environment surrounding this facility in northern Salt Lake. And it kind of gives you an idea of this center of healing that I was supposed to be a part of. What's interesting in looking at these photographs now is I see an environment that is meant to, it's meant with all the best intentions, right? It is meant to heal. But generally speaking, what adolescents learn in these kinds of environments when they're put in these situations is not that they are a valuable member of society and that their voice needs to be heard and they can speak out about the things they believe in, but rather we learn that we are broken. And I'm not saying this happened to me. I am no way a victim. But that's the lesson that was imparted upon me, that something was wrong with me, that I was somehow still, again, and even more so outside of society. And I was a problem that needed to be fixed. So after being here for 8 months, running away 3 times, finally my parents, who you can see are obviously exhausted, they look younger than this now, they said, okay, Cory, you don't have to go back, but you can't live at home. And of course, because I knew everything about everything, I said, fine, and I marched off down the street, and thus began a short stint, not long, but a short time of homelessness, where I was seldom on the streets, but sometimes spending nights on the streets. I was living in basements, I was squatting, I was basically doing what I could to survive. And it's funny to think that, a privileged, middle-class white kid, white man, is so arrogant to think that he can cast off a formal education. Since this time, I've met young women who disguise themselves as men, literally to walk 2 or 3 hours every day, risking their lives to get an education. The idea that I had enough arrogance to cast off that opportunity is something that I feel regret and shame about. But I also believe that these were some of the most formative times for me, to see people in a way that I wouldn't have otherwise been able to. And what I mean by that is, when you see people who live on the street, oftentimes we turn our eyes away. We don't want to be a part of it. It hits at something unnerving in us. But when you open your eyes to it, you see the most basic form of us. You see a hunter or a forager. This is a forager foraging. This is a hunter hunting. This is our most natural state. This is what we did for 95% of our existence on the planet. It just so happens that there's buildings erected around these people now, and we turn away because we're insulated from it. But seeing that and seeing what the human body, the human mind was capable of in acts of aggression and kindness started to impact how I would ultimately come to tell stories and make pictures. And so when you look at some of these pictures, and I look back at those times where I was looking at life on the street, and you see how that translates into how I begin to tell stories about the human element through the lens of adventure, it starts to become relatable. It took a while for me to get out of that time period. It took some years, and in the Q&A section after, I'll answer any of those questions you have. It was a long process. It was a process of homelessness, bouncing back and forth between people's houses that would allow me to live there until they wouldn't allow me to live there, getting kicked out, trying again with my parents, getting kicked out again. And this was the toughest time for my parents. I mean, you can imagine for a parent to have to tell their child, leave, and then to lock the doors behind them and then change those locks. That is a painful experience. But it was my own arrogance and my own belief in myself that was very ill-placed that perpetuated that. It was also my struggles with depression and anxiety. And I was diagnosed with bipolar during this time period, where I didn't know how to voice exactly what I was going through. But as I came out of it, I gravitated back towards climbing. I gravitated back towards the mountains because, like I said earlier, those were the places that I felt the most aligned. Society didn't demand anything of me there. It just allowed me to be in my most natural state. And I started to take pictures to tell the story of what I was experiencing there. Climbing was in me from a young age. Climbing was always the way I expressed myself, and it was a way of exercising that angst out of me. And initially, early in my career, I actually assisted in commercial fashion. I would save money, I would save airline miles, and then I would go on climbing trips. And I'd take pictures of the climbing to try to sell to clients like Patagonia and the North Face and all of the Black Diamond, all of these climbing companies. And that was my early career. That was all I did. I used this veneer of awe to tell the story of human struggle, to tell the story of human capacity. That's what I was invested in. But I also realized that I didn't really care about the climbing. That's a secret that people often wonder. I never really cared about it. I did it because it took me to places that gave me a lens to put on and look at socio-political situations, climate change, all the big issues that started to be more exciting to me in a way and more igniting in my brain, and the things that I actually wanted to talk about. How could I use photography? How could I use travel to tell bigger stories? And that became my driving force. But again, like my early career was all this. I became a sponsored climber. Because it was, it's a rarefied skill set. I could go out on assignment, I could go on a big climbing trip, and I could take pictures that were valuable for marketing assets when I came home. And this was a trip that changed my life forever. This was the winter of 2010-11 on the 13th highest mountain in the world called Gasherbrum 2. Nobody had ever climbed this mountain in winter. In fact, all of the Tibetan and Nepali 8,000 meter peaks had been climbed in winter, but none of the Pakistani had been climbed by that point. And I was invited to go by two guys, one named Simone Moro and one named Denis Arubko. And Denis is this very strong Russian man. He has a very good accent like this, and he talks about me in front of me also. But Simone, why we bring young American boy? Very stupid, not strong. And I'm like, dude, I'm right here. And Simone, for his part, a wonderful guy, Italian guy, and he talked like this, I'm not exaggerating, okay? Talk like this, you can imagine 6 weeks talking like this, very, very fast, very, very high. And it's annoying AF, I just can't deal with it, but as the trip wore on, I started to realize that we were actually going to climb this mountain in winter, and I didn't know how much this would actually change my life. This is on the summit day. We're at about 7,500 meters, climbing through the sunrise. Masherbrum is the mountain. It's just peeking into the sun behind us at 7,800 meters. And as we climbed to the top, I understood that something was going to shift in my life, that my life was going to be irrevocably altered. How that was going to play out, I didn't really know. As we started to descend, we got caught by a massive storm. We had about a 12-hour window to make it to the summit, and we hit that. We hit it right in the middle. And 6 hours into our descent, 100-mile-an-hour winds hit the mountain. We crawled into the tent that we almost lost. I looked at the temperature that night in the tent with 3 men huddled together. It was minus 51 degrees. And I knew at this point that the something that might shift in me could be my life, and that this was likely a situation where we might not make it out of. And we got down to our first camp, and we were making our last day down to base camp, and it had snowed about this much to the point where we were, waist deep in snow, and you could hear avalanches coming down all around us, and we just had to start walking down the glacier. And I remember right after I took this picture, I heard, what sounded like a sort of a clap of thunder, and I looked up to my right, and there was a very low cloud layer, and all of a sudden there was a massive avalanche coming towards us. And you can imagine trying to run in a situation like this. There is no running. You just accept and you get tossed. And that's what happened. And what happens in an avalanche is, it's really disturbing, because it goes blue, dark blue, blue, dark blue, dark blue, darker, dark blue, darker, darker, black, darker, black. And what's happening is the weight of your body is getting pulled down by gravity under the snow. And it's like being in a Maytag. It's like being in a monochromatic Maytag. And you just accept, you try to swim, you do all the things that you're told to do in an avalanche, and none of that works. It's all crap. I just remember being so mad. I was just angry. And life does pass before your eyes in a weird way. But it's not in the way you think. It's like, I remember thinking, I'm not kidding, Cheerios? Why? Parking tickets? What? But I was just pissed off. I'm like, these are my dying thoughts? $15, Boulder Municipal Court? Fuck you. I was mad. But I was mad because I knew that my life was over. I was mad that I hadn't accomplished so many things that I wanted to do, and I was just furious. And then all of a sudden, right at the last second, I stopped, and my head was out of the snow. And my arm was lodged under my chin, and I remember thinking, well, okay, I'm alive, but Simone and Dennis are dead, and now I have to find my way down, and I'm almost certainly going to die on the way down. And then I heard, Cory, everything is okay. And I was like, no, it's not. Nothing is okay right now. And I felt, and all of a sudden I started to feel his hands sort of digging around me. And I don't know how much time passed. And then, I started to be able to move, and I felt all this emotion coming up. And then I heard this other voice, which was, Simone, I too am okay. Somehow all three of us survived. We got tossed about 500 feet across flat ground. And I think what happened is the sheer force of the avalanche pushed us out in front, and we really just got rolled along the flat ground in the deposit zone of the avalanche. So we got thrown over some crevasses, and as we emerged from this, and as soon as I could grab my camera, I turned it on, and I took a photo of myself, and this is that. And I know I'm going to be ugly when I'm 90, and it sucks. Don't date me. I'm not going to age well. But it's interesting. I sent it to my mom. She said, it's a stunning photograph. Who is it? And I told her, and she said, gross. But it's funny, I look at it now and I see so much of my life has elapsed. 9 years has gone by since this photo was taken. But what I see in my eyes is fear. And I see something coming now in hindsight. What happens when the mind prepares for death, and what happens when the brain has been through developmental trauma, like physical violence from my brother growing up, is it plants seeds that can erupt into an episode of PTSD when a traumatic occurrence happens in life. It doesn't matter what it is. It can be combat related, it can be an avalanche, it can be a car accident. We don't really understand what triggers trauma in the brain. What we do know is that if you have previous trauma, you are far more likely to experience PTSD severely in some fashion. So what I see here is my brain trying to make sense of the situation that never resolved. That resolution would have been my death. The brain prepares for death, and when it doesn't happen, it just continues to spin and spin and spin, and you start to look for resolution. And when you can't find the resolution, you try to find a way to numb the spinning. You numb the hum. That's where drugs and alcohol come in, and we'll get to that. But first, I just want to say, it's also proof that you can take a selfie and get it on the cover of National Geographic magazine. So I keep going with that. National Geographic has been my home for a long time, but it took a while to get there. When I came back from G2, I started to feel an immediate disassociation. I started to feel more separate than I ever had, and I didn't understand what that was. I got married, I had a wonderful community, and I felt more and more and more disconnected. I felt more and more alone than I ever had in my entire life, even though my career was starting to sort of move forward in a positive way. What's also interesting is that this became my life, doing exactly what I'm doing right now, standing up and telling this story. But without the resolution of the avalanche, and without knowing that I was beginning to suffer from a severe episode of PTSD, I actually continued to re-traumatize myself. There was a movie that was made, I showed it on stage, we recreated the experience, there was footage from it, and without the resolution, that just further damaged my brain. It's a really fascinating thing that happens with trauma. But it wasn't just trauma that G2 gave me. It was also an amazing opportunity to practice what would become my career, which is storytelling. Like I said, up to that point, all I did was take pictures of incredible climbs and sell rain jackets. I was sort of a glorified raincoat salesman. But it was during this time that a editor from National Geographic reached out and said, hey, can you show me an example of your storytelling work? And I totally lied, and I said, yeah, of course. And I didn't even know what she meant. I was storytelling, what's that? So quickly, at base camp in Pakistan, I started going over and hanging out with the Pakistani military that was camped next to us. Now, this is an active conflict border with India. It's the highest battle zone in the world. It is populated by men that are, 18 to 24 years old, living a lot of times at their highest camps above 20,000 feet. What's interesting about this is it's not bullets that are killing these guys. It's avalanches, it's exposure, it's altitude, it's illness. This is a very inhospitable area to patrol and to monitor for really a war that has been ongoing since partition. And what was kind of crazy about the situation is how it all came to be. I started going over and sort of having tea in these broken conversations, and then they started coming over to our tent, and they saw that we had satellite internet. And then they started asking if they could use my computer for Facebook. And I was like, what do you say? I mean, no? So of course you can use it. And now I have 100 friends named Farouk and Ahmed and Mohammed, and I'm on the TSA watch list, but it's fine. I hate that part of it, but it's good. And we became very quick friends. And they started inviting me in and, hey, come over, we're having movie night. And really, this is all through very broken English, Urdu, it was mostly hand gestures. But it taught me a lot about how to communicate in situations that were uneasy, that were awkward. And I started making this, package of pictures that some I was very proud of, some I hated. I mean, this is not a great photograph, but it speaks to the human element. Like, who brings a purple tracksuit to a white war zone? I just don't get that. And then who hangs it out to dry in -40? It just becomes a Frisbee, You're like, want to play Frisbee with your pants? But in all of that, I came away with a collection of images that would land me my first article for the magazine. This is somebody's, for all the levity and all the fun we had, this is somebody's foot frozen in ice. Bertrand Russell says, war does not determine who is right, only who is left. And I find that to be very apropos. It's a very serious thing. This is somebody's brother, probably somebody's father, somebody's son. And we continue to send our young men and women into these areas of conflict with very little forethought. We think that violence is the only way, and so often they end up just like this. But again, it was a package of images that got me my first assignment to the border of Nepal and Tibet, where we were using climbing to access these ancient caves. They had been carved out by hundreds of years of generations before. This is an ancient library. And you can see these are pretty hard to get to, and we would ask the locals, how would the ancient people access these caves? And they say, oh, they're very powerful, they fly. They're like, cool, we've lost a lot. It was on one of these assignments, one of these trips, I broke my back falling trying to get to these caves, and had to be helicoptered out. What we were, looking for was any evidence of habitation that would give us clues as to how this society lived when they were still in the caves. And so you can imagine my job is trying to bring you, this audience, to this room where you're picking up an ancient piece of pitch on, you're blowing it off, it's seeing light for the first time in literally, maybe over 1,000 years. And some of what we were finding was so beautiful. Stunning illuminated folios. These predate Buddhism on the Tibetan plateau. This is the Bun tradition. So some of these things were wildly old, but what we were really searching for, what we were hoping to find, and what we finally did find, was human remains. Because in human remains, you have human teeth, and in teeth, we have strontium. Strontium is like God's geotag for us, where we were born. Depending on what's in the water that you're drinking in your mother's breast milk, we can actually index where somebody was born by what the strontium in their teeth, in their tooth enamel. And what that does is if you find a burial crypt in a cave, you can say, well, this person died in northern Nepal, but they were actually born in Sichuan, or what is now Sichuan. And this person died in northern Nepal, but they were actually born down in India. And when you start to index over 100 individuals, like we found in this burial crypt, you start to have a beautiful picture of trade and a pathway that was frequented during the Silk Road era that cut straight down off the Tibetan plateau and into the Tibetan subcontinent, or the Indian subcontinent. That was my first assignment. It was illuminating to start to connect adventure with science that had some purpose. When I come back from these assignments, I started to feel disconnected. Like the only thing that could make me feel ignited, that could make me feel like I was a part of something, was being on assignment. I'd come back into this world that we live in, and I felt more isolated and alone than I ever had, and that hum would return. And it was as if the work that I was doing in the field was staving off the hum. So when I came back and I couldn't find a way through it, I started to drink, and I started to drink a lot. It was as if the only places that could really squelch that and squash that constant anxiety and that constant darkness that was there and sort of growing, and it was connected to G2, but I didn't know. The only places that I could find relief from that was in the field. So I threw myself at work, and I sacrificed all of my relationships, and I started to sacrifice my marriage. One of the assignments I did was in the American West, up on the border of Yellowstone, looking at the confluence and conflict of people and predators in the greater Yellowstone ecosystem. What happens when man butts against an intact ecosystem? How do we operate? What do we do to an ecosystem as a species? Are we invasive? I don't know. I mean, I'm starting to ask these questions with the photography became my purpose. At one point, there were 20 million bison on the American plains. Now we're down to 5,000 wild bison in Yellowstone. How did that happen? What were the results? Those were the questions I was getting at. We replaced the bison with cattle. There's nothing wrong with cattle, but they weren't adept to this land. So they were vulnerable to predators. So what did we do? We killed the predators. There's a chain reaction. And so my assignment was looking at how we start to treat things when we don't think about how we start to treat ecosystems, how we start to treat each other when we don't think inclusively about them, when we don't think downstream. My next assignment was to Myanmar, on the border of Tibet, looking at the eastern tip of the Himalaya. And because of conflict, decades of civil war, this place had been sort of locked away. And Bagan was one of the, sort of the farthest north place you could go. And then when you went up into the Kachin state, it just became a nebulous hole on the map. And our goal here was to climb up into the eastern tip of the Himalaya and map and chart this section of the mountains and try to figure out which was the highest peak there and sort of give a new geographic reference for that area. And we decided to do it the hardest way possible. And I don't know why. That just seems like it's part of my life. People are like, well, this seems like a hard assignment. Who should we give it to? And they're like, give it to Cory. I don't know. It seems like he's dumb enough to take it. So we took trains, planes, automobiles. We took a boat up the Irrawaddy River. And finally, we took motorcycles 80 miles into the jungle with the baby Hells Angels, which was an incredible journey. This one morning I woke up and there was this guy and he was sitting there. He was my driver. You can see he's a super happy guy. He cracked a beer and it was 7:30. And I was struggling with drinking at this point. So I'm like, I get it. I understand. He poured some out and I was like, oh, that's cool. Some for the homies. I get it. I don't get it. Anyway, the next thing he did is he opened a bottle of Cobra whiskey and topped off his beer with the Cobra whiskey. And I was like, I'm riding with that guy today. This is going to be fun. It wasn't fun. We crashed and ruined one of my lenses. But ultimately, at the end of 80 miles, we began our walk, which was 150 miles through the jungle to the eastern tip of the Himalaya. For any of you who have not walked through a jungle, don't. It's terrible. It's absolutely horrible. The trees want to kill you, the snakes want to kill you, the spiders want to kill you, everything wants to kill you. And it was one of the most miserable assignments of my life, largely because so much of me was falling apart inside. By this time, that hum that I experienced when I was back home started to catch up with me in the field. The relationships that I had started to ignore were nagging at me. And so I was dragging these huge weights through the jungle, this endless tunnel of green. But I was reminded how simple life actually is and how simple life can be by the people that we encountered along the way. I was reminded of some of the people that I encountered in my time on the streets. These people, if they get hungry, they hunt or they die. If they get sick, they heal or they die. There is no road out. There's no helicopter to come get them. We tend to make our lives inordinately complex. And life, at its core, at its base, is very, very simple. And I've had the great good fortune of being reminded of that in so many ways. Finally, after over 30 days of walking and taking all these various means to get here, we found ourselves on the edge of the Himalaya and realized that we had put so much into the effort just to get here that we were likely going to fail. And so after 10 days of climbing, 41 days total, we made the decision that we had to turn around just below the summit at 20,000 feet. And I was so fearful that this failure was going to mark my career and it was going to be over. My third assignment for the magazine, it would be done, it would be gone at this point. And I realized too that so much of my life was falling apart. There were so many failures that I needed to address. And this seemed just to be allegorical of all of them. It was a crushing defeat to have to understand that we had overestimated ourselves. I had drastically overestimated myself, and I started to understand on the climb that there was something about avalanches There was something about the mountains that was haunting me and that I had not gotten over, and that potentially there was something that was so troubling to me that it was unraveling everything in my life despite the success that I was having outside of it. And that was brought home in a profound way when I realized that after only 4 short years of marriage that I had completely destroyed it. It wasn't, really, I can say honestly, it wasn't her fault. It was completely my fault. My career had taken off. I didn't know how to voice anything that I was feeling, despite years of therapy and growing up in that environment. I'd started to drink. I was a full-blown alcoholic. I cheated on her all the time. And I became a horrible person. And it was also the time where my career was taking off, and I'd stand up on stage and I'd talk about virtuousness and integrity. So what I was doing and who I was being were creating this chasm inside of me. And it was just so fragilely connected. And eventually it was going to collapse, because that's what happens. You put enough pressure in there and it collapses. But rather than dealing with it at that point, I ran off to go on another assignment, because that was the only way I could do it. I went to Angola. 30 years of civil war left this place in shambles. There's a jewel in the Angolan highlands that is the source of the Quito River. And the Quito River feeds the Okavango River Delta in Botswana across Namibia with 70% of its water. So this land, this water is locked in the Angolan highlands and then flows downstream. And every year, the Okavango Delta floods with 11,000 cubic kilometers of water. And this is the beating heart of southern Africa. This is a waterway that doesn't go to the sea. It's sourced to sand. And these animals come in and they thrive, and then they disperse. What happens when Angola emerges from a civil war? A civil war that left millions, now still hundreds of thousands of landmines in the ground. What happens when they need resources? What happens when the oil industry starts to tank and they need more? They look to their waterways. They look to their natural resources. Landmines, by the way, are one of the most diabolical weapons that we've created. They're not designed to kill people anymore. They're designed to do this. They're designed to maim people. They are a horrible invention. They leave people, what they're designed to do is take off a lower leg. So you create a hole in a ground defense. And what that does is, when somebody gets injured, everybody surrounds them and it creates holes on either side. The idea that we are considering using landmines again in conflict is abhorrent to me, because what happens is we bury them, and despite our best efforts, we leave them there. And the only people that landmines really hurt are the people that are left there after the war. And the tragedy, though, is that the landmines kept this waterway and this area safe for so long. It wasn't safe to go off the roads. I mean, for years, you couldn't go off the roads. And as soon as areas are demined in Angola, the first thing that happens is people go in and they deforest it. They cut down all the trees and they burn it for charcoal. And this is one of their primary sources of income. So all of these bags are illegal charcoal. The government turns a blind eye because they don't want to fund these people. And so this is where all of a sudden my career started to take on a more journalistic bent, where I was really starting to investigate these concepts and look at, well, what do? Can you leave the landmines in the ground? No, that's a humanitarian crisis. But as soon as you take them out, it creates an environmental crisis. How do you manage those two things simultaneously? Can you? Because what happens is as soon as you take the landmines out and you deforest it, all of that root infrastructure that you see in these trees here, all of that goes away. And rather than holding those superfine Kalahari sands in place and making this a slow seep river waterway, it turns into a flood cycle. That changes everything. So our job was to take canoes, of all things, and descend the entire waterway. And it was the worst job I've ever taken in my life, truly the worst. The first day, we're like, cool, there's water and we can float. And then for the next 10 days, like sled dogs, we had 7,000 pounds, we had 7 Makoros or canoes, each weighing 1,000 pounds, and we had to drag them through razor grass. And it took about a day to go 1 kilometer trying to find water downstream. It was the hardest expedition I've ever been on, and yet one of the fondest memories I have. As soon as we found enough water, we started to get in it, and we had to chop the banks to allow the boats to actually float. Now, bear in mind, there's crocodiles in the water, there's snakes in the water. It's like 110 degrees. It's terrible. People are like, I want your job, and I'm like, cool, take it. You don't want my job. You want this part of my job. You don't want that part of my job. But truly, it was so hard. And people always ask, well, why do you do it? Why do you do the things the hard way? This is Dr. Steve Boys with hundreds of sweat beads around his head at the end of one of the days, getting out. You can imagine you're exhausted, you're getting out of the water, trying to set up camp, and you're greeted with this. But I think the truth is, for me, that the harder the journey is, the more profound the truths become, the more that is illuminated. Now, that can be more of an internal conversation, or that can actually be an external one. On this trip, it took us going here and descending this riverway to discover 6 new-to-science species of fishes, right? That's significant. We needed that information because we wanted to share with 3 governments what was at stake if they started to look to this area for resources, if they were going to sand mine it, if they were going to dam it. What would happen to these species that were previously undocumented? And also, what would happen to the people there, the social structure? I mean, for me, being there, it was like literally going back in time. It was indiscernible from 100 years ago, 100, 200 years ago, what was happening there. And some of these villages that we encountered, we asked, when was the last time you saw anybody from the centralized government? Do they know you're here? No, they don't know we're here. When was the last time? It was when UNITA came through, which was one of the militarized factions coming through, killing, raping. That's hard information to hear. It's hard information to give to governments to say, hey, there are these people living here, and it's not just about your resources, it's not just about money. It's about a social structure. It's about a waterway that sustains life. We walked 10 kilometers away from the water one day to find a village to trade for chickens and an axe. And asking them, what would happen if the river were dammed? And they said, well, we would have to move. We would die. That's the only choice we have. It's where life comes from. Meanwhile, downstream, you start to see that there's more being impacted. And upstream, you're starting to see what's indicative of what's to come. Development. Luanda is the most expensive city in the world right now, or has been in the past years. How are they using water? If you want to understand what's going to happen to a waterway, you have to look at the government in charge of it. Because this is a story about, it's bigger than one river, right? This is the story of water. And as most of us in this room know, that is our next big struggle as a human family. As ground dries up, as things heat up, water becomes more scarce. It's not just rivers, it's the oceans. When things get too acidic, what happens to the fishing? What happens to the reefs? Water is the fascia of the planet. It ties us together. It's what gives us life. And if we start to ignore these simple lessons, these simple waterways, everything else is irrevocably altered. Because it's not just a story about us, it's a story about the ecosystems that rely on all of it. The big cats, what happens to them if we clog this waterway, if we dam it? What happens to the life in the Okavango Delta? What happens to the hippos? What happens to the elephants? They're in trouble already anyway. I'm not saying that they are more important than us. That's not what I'm saying at all. It's just that we have to think inclusively versus exclusively. This was about giving information to 3 governments so they could act cohesively to protect a waterway in tandem with their needs in order to not act exclusively and kill everything else downstream. Many of you have probably seen it. A river runs through it. Eventually, all things flow into one, and a river runs through it. That is a beautiful quote. We are tied together by water. We are bound by it, and our lives, in some ways, echo that flow. And the more we can allow that, the better life seems to be. But as soon as we dam certain areas in ourselves, like I had been doing for so many years, everything downstream is affected. I was a mess. I could take a picture, but I couldn't articulate a thought. I was depressed. I was an alcoholic. I was amidst a divorce. I had blown up my relationship with my primary climbing sponsor. I had destroyed a business with two of my best friends, a production company. And I was drowning in myself. I was drowning in this tumultuous, unresolved developmental trauma that had erupted at the point of the avalanche, and I didn't know what to do. And finally, this is so odd to say, I was offered a lifeline by somebody who asked if I wanted to go back to the mountains just to climb. It was my friend Adrian Ballinger. And of course I accepted it. I accepted the invitation to go back. He had this idea of climbing Everest, and because of my photography, I was able to sign on to that trip and go with him as his partner. But I also have to stop here and say, it comes with tremendous privilege to even, for me to be a total mess and to have somebody reach out and say, hey, do you want to go do this? That comes with a privilege that I am highly aware of. And I never want to speak as if that doesn't exist. I was born lucky. It's nothing I did to earn it. It's just the way it happened. But I've always felt that because of that privilege, I have to capitalize on it. If I'm not putting a net good into the world, then what am I here for? So I said yes. I would love to go back to the mountains with you. And so the idea was I would go with Adrian to the north side of Everest and try and climb the North Ridge without oxygen, which again is just the dumbest, hardest way to do anything. You can see the theme recurring here. And he said, I've got this great idea. Let's Snapchat it. I was like, fuck you. That's the dumbest idea I've ever heard. And he said, no, I know you're allergic to social media. And I was, because I felt like I was comparing my insides to everybody else's outsides. I hate that about social media. We're always inundated by this idea of what we're supposed to be and do and look like and be thinking and experiencing, when in fact somebody's showing you a snapshot that they took 20 times to get just right and telling you their innermost deep thoughts, and you think, oh my God, they're so lucky. And meanwhile, you're comparing that to the dredge of yourself that you hate, right? And you're like, how is my life so terrible? I hate social media for that. And I said, absolutely not. And he said, no, let's do it differently. Let's actually give an uncurated view. Let's tell the story in a more honest way. So I said, okay, I'll try it with you. And we started, and we had 30 people, watching these snaps. And throughout the course of the expedition, by the end of it, by summit day, by the time I was, coming up on the summit, we had over 1 million people watching these snaps. And part of that was because I started to talk about what I was experiencing. I started to talk about my anxiety. I started to talk about my depression. I started to talk about my alcoholism. I started to speak openly about my divorce, because all of those things were, impacting how I could perform as an athlete. And so I just started to talk about it as an open source. And on May 24th, the day that we started to go for the summit, Adrian turned around at about 4 a.m. He was too cold. And he asked me, did I want to keep going? And truthfully, I didn't know. I was scared. You're dark, it's alone, you have no oxygen. There's nobody else there. This was another group that I passed. They're not going to help if, they can't really. But I kept going. And as the sun came up and I was right below the summit, I started to realize that, again, this was a pivotal moment in my life. And I kept climbing. And finally, you see all these pictures of Everest crowded with people. Finally, I was alone on the summit. There was not another person around me, nowhere near me. And it was dead calm, silent for the most part. And I realized this was as close to space as I was ever going to get. And I stood up on my tippy toes, somewhat foolishly, and reached up to the sky, and that was that. And then I cried for a second, because I was exhausted and I was scared, and then I started going downhill as fast as I could. The descent is where 80% of accidents happen. That's where most things go wrong, because you're exhausted, you're as far out as you can be, Everybody else is exhausted. Most people are running low on oxygen. I didn't have any. And by the time I got back to base camp, I'm the king of awful selfies. By the time I got back to base camp, I had been awake for 41 hours. And I had lost probably 10% of my body weight, just in calories and fluid. And this is what I looked like. And what's so interesting about this is people think that this moment, or coming down, standing on top of the world, is somehow the most pivotal moment. It's the aha moment. It's the phoenix rising. And the truth is, it was, in hindsight, it was my rock bottom. And what I mean by that is that I realized that I had done the same thing I'd always done. I'd gone to the hardest, highest, most difficult, most inaccessible place to get away from myself. I'd spent my entire life doing that. I'd spent my entire life trying to prove to people that I was good enough, because when I was 3 years old, my brother beat me up, and I didn't think I mattered. My whole life I had spent trying to get to that point, to prove to people that I had some level of value. And the truth is, I always did, but it's taken years to learn that. It's taken years to unravel that. The highest place on the planet became the lowest point in my life. Looking back on it all, and there's so much more to tell, but looking back on it, I start to go back through and ask myself, why is this important? Am I just a privileged white kid who grew up in Utah and I've abused that privilege? Or is there value to this? And I look back on the things that I've learned. I've looked back at Pakistan and I said, well, what did I learn in Pakistan? I learned the value of listening. I couldn't be bullish. I couldn't go in. I couldn't stand on stage and talk because I didn't know the language. I learned that when I listen more, I learn more. That seems like a simple lesson, but most of us spend way too much time talking, waiting for our turn to talk. And that is a profound lesson. The more I shut up, the more I take on, and the better human I can be. From Mustang, I learned it's so important to look to our history to understand where we are in our contemporary culture and where we're going. If we don't study our history, both personally, our personal histories, and also our extensive, our trajectory as a human family, we can never understand how we've arrived where we are and how to avoid the same pitfalls that we've fallen into in the past. We have to be students of history. We have to be unflinchingly honest. From my work in the American West, I learned about how my understanding of something, my understanding of the way an ecosystem works, a global ecosystem, is not the same way that somebody else understands it. My understanding is not always right, and I have to be able to be flexible enough to hold two opposing ideas in my head at the same time and be able to act empathically towards somebody who I disagree with. We can find ways through if we do that. From Burma, I learned about failure. I learned about how much you can believe in something, how much you can push yourself towards something, how driven you can be, and how you can still fail, and that failure ultimately becomes the greatest source of knowledge. All of our information, the vast majority of it, comes when we trip and fall. We learn not to step there again. That's the beauty of it. Failure is where we learn the most. Success teaches us relatively nothing. It's only in the unflinching honesty of how we failed, why we failed, be it on an expedition or in a marriage or as a human overall, that we learn. Africa taught me about source-based decision-making. And what I mean by that is, how do I think and be inclusive in my decision-making? When we are exclusive, we choke everybody out and we become isolated. When we are inclusive, we have a great force behind us that will always overcome the problems that we're facing. But when we think only about ourselves insularly and we don't think downstream, we damage everything. And in that, we damage ourselves, because nobody will come to our aid from that point forward. From the conflict work I've done and from my own personal relationships, I've had to look at how hurtful we can be, and I've had to learn from that. Every action that we take in our personal lives, we have the opportunity to say, what is the next right action? What is the next thing I can do to be a good person? Conflict is a place that is rife of people acting only in self-interest because they must. And from Everest, I learned to embrace my strengths. Like I said, I've never been a passionate climber. I love going to these places because it teaches me things. It offers me insight. It offers me lessons, and I've had the great good fortune to do that. But to embrace my strengths, to embrace who I am overall, is one of the greatest gifts that I can give the world, because that's where I show up the best. And to know where my weaknesses are. And also to not think that I'm going to resolve things by continuing to run. I've never resolved anything by running from it, only by running into it. It's interesting, this is a lifelong journey that is not over. So much of my life is yet to be resolved. I'm only 38 years old. I'm a young person. I don't know where I'm going. I might change course next week. I have no idea. And I feel this, so often students want me to say, well, what's the path? What's the path? The path is you're on it. You're on it. You might not see it, but you're on it. Everybody's still on it. My only hope is that I die the best version of myself I can be that day. And people always ask, why do I get up here? Why do I talk about, being an alcoholic, mixing that with climbing Everest, cheating on my wife, getting divorced, a river in Africa? How does it all blend together? Well, the truth is, some of it doesn't. But life is confusing. It's not meant to all blend together. And we don't see things until long after sometimes. But the real reason I talk about it all is because it's not my journey. You might not be able to understand what climbing Everest means, but you do understand what it means to run from yourself. You might not be able to understand what going down a river in Africa means, or landmines look like, but you do know what it looks like to see people in pain when one person acts exclusively versus inclusively. You might not understand walking through a jungle, but I guarantee some of you understand when I talk about anxiety and depression. It's important to me that I talk about everything, the whole journey, because that's what makes me human, and that's what makes everybody in this room human. We are brought together by the things that make us weakest, and we are then wholly woven together by our triumphs over those things. We are an incredible species. We are incredibly powerful. And it's important that we see that it's not just the pinnacles to aim for, but it's the embracing of everything that happens along the way that makes a person whole. The last photo I show, I didn't take. This was taken by Voyager 1 space probe from 3.7 billion miles away from Earth. That little dot that looks like an out pixel is Earth. Some of you guys have seen this. It's just its anniversary a few weeks ago, the pale blue dot. Carl Sagan had this to say about it. He said, look again at that dot. That's here, that's home, that's us. On it, everyone you love, everyone you know, everyone you've ever heard of, every human being who ever was lived out their lives. The aggregate of our joy and suffering, thousands of confident religions, ideologies, and economic doctrines, every hunter and forager, every hero and coward, every creator and destroyer of civilization, every king and every peasant, every young couple in love, every mother and father, hopeful child, inventor and explorer, every teacher of morals, every corrupt politician, every superstar, every supreme leader, every saint, and every sinner in the history of our species lived there on a mote of dust suspended in a sunbeam. There's nothing more appropriate than that to leave you with, because so often we get absorbed in ourselves, but looking at Earth from the perspective that we actually are living on it, this little tiny rocket ship barreling through space, that's all we have. That's it. That's all. And some people I show this photo to and they go, that makes me feel hopeless. What's the point? That is the point, literally. Because if that's all that we are responsible for, if that is all that we are meant to be stewards of, is that all we have to care for, that little tiny dot, then we get to choose what we make important in our lives. And if that's it, if that's all we have to care for, then I have to believe in my heart of hearts that together we can tackle everything that's coming our way. Thank you very much. So thank you, guys. I think I went a little bit over, but feel free to ask questions. I think we have some time. There's mics up front, and if you hate coming to the front on a mic, scream, and I'll repeat your question. I know I'm not supposed to say that, but you're going to have to scream because I can't see anything. Come on. Not one? Yes. All right, there we go.
You want to talk a little bit more about how you worked through your trauma?
Sure. Great question. So it's hard to fit all that in an hour. But as soon as I started to look into the effects of PTSD and sort of what was happening in my own life, it dawned on me that might be what I'm suffering from. Now, I started to go down that road, and I met a wonderful therapist. I'd done therapy my whole life, and I really believe in it, and I still am a huge proponent of it. And I did some stuff called EMDR, which is an amazing. We understand that it works. We don't really know how it works yet, but it's through eye movement, and it's re-engaging the opposite side of the brain that has disengaged from the trauma. So you think of it as like if you've got two fans spinning in a hard drive, one shuts down and one just keeps going, and it's waking up that other side of the hard drive to reinfuse logic into the situation so that you're no longer trapped by the emotional qualities of it. So that hum that I was referring to is the spinning. And so EMDR was really, really powerful for me. Just talk therapy is powerful for me. Quitting drinking was powerful for me when you're no longer, and I know, like, I get it. Like, I drank for years. But sort of taking stimulants out of the system was really powerful. Meditation. And I lived for a long time with this diagnosis of bipolar. And I took medication for a long time, for 26 years. I was medicated for bipolar, anxiety, and depression. And through this therapeutic process and through some various other means, I've come off those medications. And I'm not saying that people should come off. If they need them, stay on them. But that journey out of trauma, especially not recognizing that it was all tied to sort of precognitive development, took a long time for me to piece all that stuff together. I'm like, postpartum depression with my mom and my brother really made a fertile brain for a traumatic event later in life to actually take root, So that was several years of processing. And I'm still very much engaged with that because I don't think it stops necessarily. Next. Come on. All right, we got, yeah.
So, do you want to stand?
Sure. Yeah. And then you.
I know you mentioned when you were working through your trauma, you felt often alone.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. I know from one photographer to another, when you were standing behind the camera, you kind of lose sense of yourself, focus on your surroundings and everything. You're focused on the assignment that you're doing. That's all you're worried about. You kind of lose sense of your personal safety, everything else.
Mm-hmm.
Do you feel like photography, losing the sense of yourself, that might have feel anything in that?
I think we talked about this a little bit earlier when we were having a discussion with some of the students. I think photography doesn't help you feel like you're necessarily part of a community if you're doing it a lot. And I'm not begrudging it. I mean, it's obviously been my passport to the world. But the truth is, I think that it gave me a way to further escape. Like you said, you're not really thinking, you're engaged in the moment in front of you, you're trying to craft a story, and you're constantly in that process. So you're not processing all the emotional stuff that might be happening even in the moment. And also, you're constantly on assignment. You're constantly going, especially when you start to work in this sort of genre of things. You're constantly working. And so you're never home. You're never surrounded by friends. You make fast friends, but then you lose friends really fast too. So there's an element of isolation that I think is mirrored in my career that I've always felt. And if you talk to, I think I probably likely would have been an alcoholic anyway. Just based on the way I felt isolated in the world, that helped me connect, right? So I think there's something mirrored in my feeling of isolation in the profession that I've chosen. I don't know if that answers your question entirely, but yeah. And you were going to ask. Yeah. Yeah, so I think the journey from single photographs to storytelling is, I was always invested in the larger story, first and foremost. That was in me. I know some of my good friends who are commercial photographers, and their pursuit is the one picture, is selling raincoats. For me, that was never fulfilling enough. And I don't mean that their job is somehow less than mine. It's not. It's just their calling. But for me, I was always driven to try to understand things through the lens of photography versus simply celebrate a beautiful moment. So for me, it was a visual language that I was trying to interpret the world around me through. And I think instinctually, because of that and that curiosity around that's what led me through those various stages of it. Snapchat was just a weird moment. Snapchat itself was a weird moment. So it was just another, I've always been fascinated by what's the means now to tell the most effective, interesting story. And that presented itself at that time. So, yeah. Pink hat. Taking my brother on a trip, he and I are actually doing pretty well. And I would love to go on a trip with him. He's an incredible athlete in his own right. He's a wonderful human that, when you start to resolve some of this stuff in yourself, all of a sudden the anger that I held on to for so many years just doesn't make sense. Life is just too short to be pissed off at my only sibling. And I can resolve that. And if he needs to be angry at me still, for whatever reason, that's fine. That's his journey, and I'm cool with that. It's the only things that I can control in life are how I show up to it. I can't control what he does. I can't control how my parents pass away. I can't control anything. The only thing I can control is how I show up. And so I try to show up for him in the ways that he'll allow it now, and hopefully that expands in the future. I would love to go on a trip with him. We'll see, right? Yeah.
Thanks for sharing your journey in a beautiful way. There was one spot that kind of I'm still puzzled about. Early on, you said that observing homeless people,
Yeah.
you said something like, "This is how humans live for a majority of humanity," and that threw me because there's the simplicity of life that was kind of a theme throughout the presentation.
Yeah.
It's hard for me to accept that for the majority of human life, that seems like very unnaturally isolated. And that's a phenomenon that's actually more, I would think, more recent.
Well, homeless, so I think I totally get the question, 100%. I don't want to conflate homelessness with, and like the way we observe homelessness now with the way we existed as hunter-gatherer tribes. What I'm trying to illustrate there is that for, 95% of our existence as a modern sapient species, we existed in a much simpler form where we were literally foraging. And so what I'm trying to, the corollary that I'm drawing there and the line I'm drawing is these people are foraging, and I'm not saying it's a good situation that they're in, but they're out there foraging and they are next to their most natural state as a primate, whereas we're going to a store with our money and we're exchanging this thing for, something that we have no idea where it came from. Right? That scenario, their scenario, is much more akin to our natural state as a hunter-gatherer species. Does that make sense?
Yes, and I kind of sort of guessed that or deduced that, but also it's the fact that living that way within the context of our modern life here, and the way people often get to that space is about isolation and mental illness and everything. I think it's interesting as part of your story that a lot of this was about being isolated in this crowded world.
Yeah. No, that's the first time somebody's brought that up, and it's a beautiful question, and I want to make sure that I'm clear on it, because in no way do I want to celebrate the travesty that drives people to homelessness, primarily the isolation and mental health issues that we tend to culturally ignore, that push people into that scenario. That's not what I ever want to celebrate in that talking point. All I'm trying to do is illustrate the simplicity that I think is closer to our natural state as a primate. So thank you for the opportunity to clarify that. That's, yeah. Yeah.
I was just wondering, do you have a favorite way to help people?
To help people. Gosh, well, volunteering for one. There's all this. I love the research that shows how much happier we are when we volunteer. So I try to volunteer, but I also try to donate my time in context of the way I like to help people is showing up to talk about real shit. And that's why I talk about it on stage, because it invites an open conversation. You should see sometimes what happens in these afterwards. The stuff that I get told, I'm not a therapist by any means, but by giving myself over fully to people, it oftentimes opens up the conversation that they can have with me or with somebody else around them that is much more honest than the one that they were prepared to have when they came in to the room. Now, on a personal one-to-one level, I try to donate my time as much as I can to people that are trying to come up in this industry. I want to help students along the way, whether they're in school or otherwise. And then I volunteer as much as I can when I'm home. Is that, yeah. What would you tell your 21-year-old self? Put it down, bro. No, seriously, I'd probably tell him, you can stop it too. I would try to tell myself to relax, even though I know I wouldn't. I try to tell myself that, like I said in the presentation, the pathway's there, you just might not see it. I would tell myself to go harder, which is funny because I think a lot of people think I go a little bit too hard, but as I get up towards 40, which is still very young, and you guys will get, as soon as you're my age, you're gonna be like, oh my God, yeah, it feels like so young. I feel 18. I never got older somehow. But you get to that point and you're like, oh wow, this does come to an end, and people in your life pass away. And so when I say go harder, I mean, go harder at noticing what you're already a part of. Go harder at trying to make your dreams come true. Go harder because it is short. This is short. It's fast. And I'm looking going, God, I hope I'm not halfway through. But my dad's 75 and he's gonna die. you know? That's pretty much halfway through. That's scary. So go harder. Just go after it. Whatever you want, get it. I know that's kind of cliche, but yeah.
You talked about your journey up to this point. What do you still see as being something you want to change or grow or pursue that you still need to do work on?
Oh, everything. Yeah, everything. I mean, you know, it's funny. People are like, oh, you're a National Geographic photographer. That's the thing. You know, you got there. You did it. And I'm like, no, that's always been one rung on the ladder. And so there's a huge future ahead. And I don't know exactly what it's going to do, you know, where it'll take me. I'm interested, you know, I'm very interested in film. I'm interested in policy. You know, I'm interested in activism, but I also don't want to spend my life fighting. So, I mean, but then there's also all sorts of interpersonal things that I still need to work on. You know, there's the big goals, and then there's the even bigger ones that are just housed within me. You know, eventually I want to be able to have a functioning relationship. That would be awesome. Now, what is it? 9 out of 10 recently surveyed girlfriends say I'm selfish. So I don't know. You know, like I get that, and I want to be more selfless. So that's a huge answer. That's a big question. I don't know exactly how to answer it in the time we have. Yeah, go ahead. Yeah, every day. Do I ever feel like I screwed up? I mean, yeah. I think that's sort of the Burma story in here. Like, that's a very large, or it's a very, I guess, sort of loose illustration of the importance of failure. But I feel like I've screwed up consistently. How I've handled, how I've composed myself. I'm a reactionary person at times, or I have been historically. And so learning how to not be reactionary, like, rather than writing an angry email to the entire corporation of North Face with the CEO, like I probably could have handled that better. You know, maybe, just maybe. But instead, I had to have my last word, and I just, you know, breaking my keyboard, and you know what? Nothing changed out of it. That email made zero bit of difference, aside from the fact that it burned one bridge that will never be repaired, right? Like, and so I think there's moments like that I've gone through in life where I've had to look back and go, I'm really ashamed of how I composed myself. I'm really ashamed of how I acted. But because of that, and because I can feel in my body where that sits, I can go, you know what? I can sit down and write the email, but I never send it anymore, right? That's growth. Hopefully I don't have to burn 1,000 bridges.
Do you feel that your photography is something that will help change the mindset of political leaders?
God, I love you. How old are you?
13.
All right, leave it to the 13-year-old to just like mic drop. You know, yes, I would hope so. But let me say it in this way. I think too often we allow things that are not political to become political. We don't need, you know, our belief system doesn't need to dictate what political party we're affiliated with. Our belief in the environment or what, it doesn't have to mean that we're right or left, right? Those things are not political issues, but they've become political because of the way big interests sort of have input in our lives, right? And I think it's incumbent upon us to understand that we can choose what is political for us. But the betterment of the world and humankind is not a political issue. So I would hope that my photographs in some ways can ignite that idea, that a better future for all of us is not an issue of right or left or red or blue or whatever country you live in and however those political parties identify. Because remember what Carl Sagan said about this. economic doctrines, political ideologies, they've all come and they've all gone. And the one that we live in right now will go. So the idea that we can just show up and be better people, that's where I want my photography to lead. That's a great question. Yeah, I was angry for a long time with my parents, and they were angry with me. You know, the thing is, that like you know, as all parents in this room do, and all children, because we are all children, you don't get to pick your family, right? And I think that time period was the hardest for my parents, but quite honestly, we are closer now than we've ever been, because rather than turning off the switch of communication, we always just kept cranking through the communication. Even if it shut down for time periods, we always were committed to talking. And we were always committed ultimately towards where we are now, to being honest with one another. And as hard as that can be sometimes. But we've arrived at a place where we can talk really about anything. And I've alluded, my dad's terminal right now, and the conversations that we get to have about that are beautiful. They are shockingly raw and real and beautiful. And I think it's because we went through so much shit together. That's allowed us to just open up. So it's not always easy, but it's always valuable. Yeah, that's a good question.
What's a question that you wish people asked you more often?
What was that?
What's a question you wish people asked you more often?
Oh man, that's a hard one. I don't know. That's a great question. I'm going to think about that one. I could come up with some flowery bullshit, but I'm not going to. I don't know. I just don't know. Yeah. Oh.
Everest on with no oxygen. What made you do that? That's very dangerous. 200 people in the world have ever done that.
Yeah.
Did you have a backup plan?
You sound like my mom. No, I'm just joking. In a good way. Like I said, I've always pursued things in I've always been fascinated by the most difficult path, for better or worse. And I felt as though Everest, to me, I grew up, I was raised on stories of the Himalaya. And so I had this vision in my head, and my dad read us books about Reinhold Messner and Peter Habler when they first climbed it without oxygen. And then I became entrenched in a culture that was obsessed with purity in alpinism and all this very niche inside baseball stuff that makes no difference to anybody, right? But to me, it felt like I should try to bring myself up to the level of the mountain versus bring the mountain down to my level. That's not a commentary on how anybody else decides to do it. I think if people climb it with oxygen, that's great, just clean up. I want people to have that experience, to be able to share that. If it connects them to the planet, just don't be a jerk about it. But for me, I've always felt that if I can do it in the most pure way, I absolutely should. And if I can't do it in the most pure way, maybe it's not for me. And I know we didn't have a backup plan.
So my question was, you talked about like bipolarism and therapy, and you go out on these extremes and on the fringe of the earth and all this stuff, and you have to kind of stuff all this stuff down in this bag, how, and eventually you've obviously unpacked it. Can you kind of talk about that side of it a little bit more, like the getting off the drugs and all that stuff?
Yeah. This is a big topic, and I think the reason I talk so openly about it is because so many people in our culture are dealing with it, and it's not something that we discuss really openly. So I appreciate the question. I was diagnosed with bipolar in the late 90s, and there, for those of you who are in the psychology profession know that was a time period where like pretty much every adolescent got diagnosed with bipolar disorder. It wasn't a good thing. We sort of had this blanket diagnosis, and anybody who was acting out got diagnosed and medicated. And that was sort of the beginning of this trajectory that we've been on with heavy medication and whatnot. That's not to say that there isn't a problem in culture and society that's actually fueling that. But I would actually say, if I look at it clearly, I was misdiagnosed. I was probably not bipolar. I probably had severe ADHD, which can present very similarly, right? They're very close in how they show up. And so whether or not I needed to be medicated for all that time is up for grabs. I don't know. I was, and I believed strongly that it helped me. And I still believe that it was the right thing. Coming off of it was a choice that I decided to make because I simply wanted to know myself, is this something that I still need? And again, I don't encourage that for people that find that it helps. But I got to a point where I'm like, is this helping? That's what prompted my exploration with that. I'm not sure, is there?
No, yeah, you answered it, yeah, for sure, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it was a long process, and I'm very adamant about exploring new therapies that are coming up. There's a lot of stuff that's coming out now that is showing a lot of promise with sort of resetting the nervous system that I'm a huge fan of. But for me, that journey was, like I said, it took 26 years, and it's but the other thing is like, if I start to have problems with anxiety and depression again, I'm totally okay with going back on medication for the time that it's needed. I have no stigma attached to it.
Right.
Awesome.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thanks, man.
Yeah, you bet.
All right. So you've had the privilege of visiting these places that allow us to see our planet in its true form. Mm-hmm. Is documenting climate change a thing that you're looking forward to, or you might end up doing at some point in time?
That's a great question. So climate change is one of those. I've done several stories on climate change. They're just not in this presentation. We looked at, Franz Josef Land, which is this northern archipelago in the Barents Sea, one of the last intact ecosystems on the planet. And that was my first story on climate change. Documenting climate change is interesting right now because climate change, one of the problems that we've had is we try to swallow it whole as climate change, which is an incomprehensible, massive problem that we can't really grasp. It's like the human brain trying to understand what 1 trillion is. We don't get it. We're here for 80 years. The number 1 trillion doesn't make sense to us. And it's the same thing with climate change. So in approaching climate change, I want to find ways to unlock the conversation that are more digestible. And there's a lot of coverage of, polar bears and melting ice and things like that. But there's so much more, like climate justice, climate refugees, that I think have more digestible amounts of information that we can feel like we can act on. The problem is when we cover it holistically, one big thing, we feel paralyzed. It's too big. And so I'm really excited by that. I'm excited by, exploring the confluence of climate change and religion. Has anybody looked there? How are we, can that be something that moves the dial? So that's a great question. So we're going to do one more, and we'll go there.
So when you're on assignment and when you're traveling through, how do you choose whether or not when you're taking pictures, whether to interfere what's happening in front of you, or how do you choose whether to just leave it as is?
That's a great question. From a journalism perspective, how do you choose to get involved or not, essentially? And the truth is, I never get involved, or I try not to. As soon as I'm involved, I've altered the situation, right? Unless I'm not there in sort of a journalism capacity. But I think what you're asking more is like, how do you know when it's okay to be there? in some ways. Is that like, I mean, how do I choose what to engage in?
Yeah, how do you choose whether you want to be a journalist in that moment or whether you want to be human?
Well, okay, that's a great question. Can I push back and say, are they mutually exclusive? Can you be a human and a journalist at the same time? I mean, and maybe it's a rhetorical question. I think you can, but at the same time, I struggle with myself and with other colleagues with, around parachute journalism, where you come in and you take all these pictures and then you leave and then you go back to your, comfortable house, and meanwhile you were just with people who are, displaced by conflict or climate change or whatever it is. I mean, there are serious ethical hurdles that I have to get over at times. But if I am there to tell a story, and if I am hired to be there, then that is my job and my charge. If I can do something to help somebody without fundamentally altering a situation, then I absolutely will. And if I feel like it's between telling a story or saving a life, then obviously I'm going to put down the camera. But that's an extreme situation. That's very extreme. And a lot of journalists would totally disagree with me on that point. That's just where I land on it. So thank you guys so much for tonight. I really appreciate it.